Afternoon, everyone. Eastern Standard Time. It is 1 o'clock. 1:15 actually, 1:16. We are thrilled to be with you today. We are excited to talk about the creation of virtual learning communities at George Mason University. Want to get us started by letting you all know that we recognize we only have 45 minutes. So we have put some additional words on our screen than we normally would in an effort to give you all of that background information. I'm also going to drop a link in the chat for both our presentation and a worksheet that we will be referencing throughout the presentation. But just so you all know, good information in that PowerPoint that you can follow along with us. We're going to go ahead and introduce ourselves. My name is Aysha Puhl. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am the Associate Director of Residential Student Education and Engagement, Housing and Residence Life at George Mason University. My area oversees our residential curriculum, our learning communities, large-scale programming, assessment, and student staff recruitment, selection, and training. Been at Mason for just under 13 years, originally from the DC metropolitan area.
Good afternoon, folks. My name is Devon. I'm the Assistant Director of Residential Academic Engagement and Housing Residence Life at George Mason University. That means I primarily work with all of our learning communities. I've been at Mason for almost 7 years now and working with our learning communities for about 3 years now.
Hi, folks. My name is TJ Carney. I use he, him, his pronouns. And I am the coordinator of residential academic engagement. So similar to Devon, I work with all of our learning communities kind of at a broad scale. And I've been at Mason for a little over a year now, about a year and a half.
Oh my goodness, I can't believe it's been a year. We wanted to pause for a moment and give a land acknowledgement for George Mason University. We recognize that George Mason University sits on the homelands originally belonging to the Kinawa, Piscataway, Kanuy, and Dogue peoples. We wanted to acknowledge that today, as most of us are presenting from right outside Fairfax County.
So just a brief overview of what we're going to be discussing today. So obviously we're starting off and we're going to give you a little historical context. We always say context matters for what we do. So we're going to be talking about how we pivoted our learning communities today. So we'll give you the context of what living learning communities at Mason were like before the pivot, before COVID hit, and before we started our VLCs. We'll then talk a little bit about the COVID impact, some of the charges that were set forth, what we had to work with, and working through that entire pivot process. We'll then talk through the planning, logistics, and resources. So that'll kind of be the bulk of what we're going to be discussing today, is how we did that planning, what went into it, and then we'll talk about the overview of the virtual learning communities, or VLCs, as you'll hear us abbreviate them. We'll give you an overview of that, kind of what all that planning was for, what the product was that came out of that planning. And then we'll talk a little bit about some lessons learned. So what were some successes, and as well as what were some challenges that we faced through the planning process that ultimately led to the development of these VLCs. As Aysha shared that link, there is a participant reflection worksheet. So we encourage you to think about your own project or initiative or program that maybe you're working on or you want to work on, something that might need a fast turnaround. And as we go through the presentation, there will be intentional sections where we'll stop and go over some of these reflection questions. And we just encourage you, again, if you want to take notes somewhere, just to get you thinking about how you can tie this presentation back to something at your own campus that you might want to implement.
So speaking of those reflection questions, the first one that we have for you all is that identifying a program, initiative, or process that you work closely with. We recognize that everyone who's joining us today might not be looking at this through a learning community lens, which is absolutely fine. We are mainly using that as our vehicle to talk about our planning process, although we love our learning communities and they are a huge part of our work. So thinking about something that you work closely with that might be a core of your work that if you had to change it quickly, or if there was a crisis, what are some pieces that you'd have to think through in order to make that happen successfully? So that is what we want you all to do as we go through, so you can kind of think about your own program or initiative as we talk through our steps. So as we mentioned, context is important for us, and we are going to start with providing context around our learning community program at Mason. We have had learning communities for well over a decade, but this has been a massive growing program over the past few years. We've seen an expansion, not only in the number of students that have been participating in this program, but the number of our campus partners that are participating as well. It's had strategic goals for a few years, even more planned growth. It's something that we have been very, very proud of. This is something that TJ and I, it's our full-time job to work with our learning communities and see them kind of grow. For us, our learning communities involve a residential aspect, so they are living learning communities. Students live on a floor or in a building who share that common major, interest, or identity. Something that's really important for our model to know is that we utilize a co-ownership model, meaning every single learning community has at least one non-housing and residence life partner who co-owns that experience and works collaboratively with us to bring it to life. We have memorandums of understanding with every single one of these partners, and they range from academic units, colleges and schools, to other student affairs units as well. We have a very wide umbrella of topics that we offer in our learning communities. Some of them are major-based, so our engineering community is only for our students in that school, while others are very interdisciplinary interest-based. We have a leadership through community engagement community, which is all about civic engagement and citizenship, while also having some identity-based communities too. We mainly have our first-generation college student and our LGBTQ+ identity communities. They are variety in size. Some are small, some are very, very large, some were mixed level, some were first year only, some were upper level only. So we had a very wide variety of things to think about in our learning communities when we were hit with a pandemic. Also important, we have a linked course or curriculum with all of our learning communities. This means that students are either enrolled in a course together, or in the case of some of our upper level communities, they are participating in the upper level academic curriculum for that school. So our upper level art students are all taking upper level arts courses. These are all really key components of our program that are really important to kind of consider as we move forward and talk about what happened next. Something else to highlight is what we consider to be kind of core values within our learning community program. You're going to hear us say collaboration quite a bit throughout this presentation because it is how we do our work, not only with our learning community partners who co-own these experiences, but with other key campus partners as well who are impacted. Our student experience is always going to be front and center. The best planning and passion means nothing if we're not impacting our students and creating a really meaningful experience for them. Intentionality also matters. Having these topic-based communities and doing them well is what makes them impactful. And so that was something we had to keep in mind pretty heavily as we look to pivot. And then learning, right? It is great for our students to build relationships. They make their lifelong friends and find their people, but we're also still looking to foster that love of learning and helping them both in and out of the classroom. You know, sometimes they learn great things in the classroom. Sometimes our students get so passionate about engineering, they build robots out of our remotes. True story, that happened. Passion for love of learning and engaging with those different topics.
So to go ahead and get us started in talking about our planning process, we wanted to further set the stage and where we were starting about a year ago, so late February, early March 2020. Mason is a large public institution. We have just over 6,000 students living on campus with us and a much larger population living off campus, but coming to campus regularly for coursework and engagement on campus, both at the undergraduate and graduate level. So in spring and summer, we closed our halls like most folks on this call probably did, with the exception of those students that absolutely had nowhere else to go. We sent our student staff home and we started to quickly plan for fall. When we started to plan for fall, it was pretty obvious to us quite right away that we were not going to have a normal fall. So everything we had already planned for, and we do plan ahead in learning communities, needed to look a lot different. At the same time as we realized that COVID was going to have a pretty big impact on what the residential experience looked like, we were also getting a lot of anxious leadership, fear over loss of revenue, particularly in housing and residence life. Like many of you, we are an auxiliary unit, so we only have the budget that we make, and that is how we pay our staff. That's how we keep our buildings running, right? So fear of loss of revenue, fear of loss of our returning students. So would our current students return to live with us next year? And then fear of our new students. Would the students that were joining us as first-year students still choose Mason? And would they choose to live on campus if we were, impacted by COVID, and what our plans were with COVID? Really, we're going to determine how many students were going to reside with us and engage and decide to still stay enrolled at Mason. So those of us in Housing and Residence Life who are on the leadership team, we were asked to create proposals that would look at how our areas would respond to COVID and make some educated plans around that. So my team is the Student Education Engagement Team. We wrote a pretty detailed proposal around how we could continue to engage our students, even if we had reduced occupancy in the halls, how we could also continue to employ 100% of our undergraduate student staff, which was a goal and an ask of our Vice President as well as our Chief Housing Officer. So we quickly realized what the limitations were of COVID within that model. And part of that proposal was to leverage our current partnerships in learning communities into a virtual learning community model just for those learning communities that we already had. We knew that the limitations of COVID and the reduced occupancy meant that we were not going to be able to move forward with our learning communities in the programmatic way that they exist, but also in the occupancy and the reserved spaces way that they exist. So we were brainstorming ways to continue the learning community model, but in a virtual setting. And that really required not only a core understanding of our program, so the things that Devon mentioned in those core values, but really understanding the strong relationships that we had. Could we get our partners to pivot from an in-person model to a virtual model? And at the time, we felt we definitely could by explaining to them kind of what were the pros and cons and how we were going to still be there to support them. So we quickly started to pivot our current engagement model within the residential setting to a virtual engagement model when our university leadership saw that one little bullet point in our proposal around the creation of virtual learning communities and asked us, what if this were open to anyone? What if we created virtual learning communities, not just for the students that were planning to be in the learning communities in the residence halls, but for any student. It was quickly seen as a way to hopefully keep our students engaged and enrolled at Mason, to be able to connect them to university-wide initiatives as well as to resources on campus, whether they were studying on Mason's campus or whether they decided to study entirely virtually for the fall. So what was originally a let's turn our current program into a virtual program became let's create virtual learning communities for any undergraduate student for the next academic year. So we're going to pause for our reflection. And so as we've kind of shared so far, what are the core goals and outcomes of your program? So whatever program you selected earlier in Devon's slide when we started this worksheet, those core goals and outcomes are really important for us as we started to think about pivoting our program from an in-person model to a virtual model. Who are your key partners and allies outside of your immediate team? As I mentioned, in addition to the folks on my staff who looked at that engagement model, we quickly had to ask ourselves whether or not our partners would follow along with us. And then last but not least, who should you have as a stronger who should you have a stronger relationship with to support your program? We quickly, and we're going to talk through that in the next set of slides, we very quickly started to think about who else do we need to bring to the table as we pivot these learning communities to virtual learning communities.
So as you can see from this slide, there's a lot going on over the course of the 4 months from May to August, and there's a lot to do over a relatively short period of time. As Aysha mentioned earlier in the presentation, we usually plan at least a year in advance for the next learning community cycle, and we had 2 months to create this entire experience. And so we're on quite the time crunch. So May was really just kind of the planning for the planning. We started doing things like writing our proposals, getting those stakeholders informed and onboarded, both new stakeholders and our partners that we had previously worked with in our Living Learning Community program, and making some of these key decisions about what the model was going to look like. As we transitioned into June, that's when really the bulk of the new work was taking place. June was a bit of a blur, but we convened our subcommittees. Each component of the virtual learning community experience had a subcommittee devoted to it. We worked on a lot of the logistics, so things like getting the application up and running, getting our student staff model figured out for it, and then we dove into some of those nitty-gritty details. So things like determining courses, what course requirements there were, what communities needed courses, getting things like our marketing up and running, those actual social media posts and info sessions that we can get out to folks to really promote this over, again, a really short period of time, with our new and returning students wondering what's coming next in learning communities. In July, we kind of continued to build on what we created in June. So we kind of had the foundation and then we worked to build on that. So again, keeping our stakeholders informed, constantly doing meetings with our partners. Recruitment and placement kind of began and kept going throughout July. And then we designed some intentional trainings as well, especially for professional staff, but also for our student staff as well, to get them up to speed with the model and informed about what they would be doing as we transitioned into August, which is kind of putting it all together. So everything that we had worked on, we started to put together in August. And so we got student staff trained. We started actually using our VLC platform, what we call our Mason 360 engagement platform is where all the engagement takes place. So we started getting that up and running and actually utilized as students began to join their communities and kind of look for that engagement piece. And then we had things like our program plans were actually designed and submitted by our coordinators so they could start to be implemented throughout the community. So it was a lot to do over a short period of time, but we did make it happen over the course of mainly 2 months.
Looking at planning, we also wanted to touch on the proposal that we have mentioned. This was a really important component of our planning process. From the moment that bullet point appeared in a division-wide presentation, it became really apparent that we were going to have to inform a large amount of people in a very short period of time about the entirety of the learning community program and the needs to change to a virtual learning community. We are it's both fortunate and a lot of hard work on this team that we are very knowledgeable about our program and best practice data. And so that helped us to pull together a lot of components really, really quickly. We have a lot of data that we have close at hand that speak to the benefits of our program. We really looked at the COVID impacts and justification for shifting to a virtual setting. So what are all the pieces of a learning community and what was our gut feeling, whether it could or could not shift and still remain a learning community program? We asked a lot of what makes this different from an online club and how can we convert that to a virtual setting. We worked very quickly to identify all collaborative partnerships, ones that we felt would be confirmed and ones that we felt would be potential. One thing that benefited us is we were in the process of launching a brand new, even larger learning community model for this coming academic year, and we had partners who were ready to start with us this coming fall 2021. So we identified them as well and brought them on a year early. We did include research on best practices. It's pretty well known on our campus at this point that if you are getting a presentation from the learning community team, there will be field research on best practices, but not just in learning communities. We also took the time to look into what is out there around virtual engagement in learning communities. We used our best judgment to do a very basic model and include all those next steps as well to inform upper leadership and our partners what those few months were going to look like and all the key decisions we had to make. I do like to say we wrote all of this down in only 4 pages. We are not brief, as it was supposed to be a 1-pager. We can't do it in 1 page, in 4 pages. And we wrote this in less than 24 hours. I think Aysha and I got the ask at about 10 a.m. and by that evening, we had it written. It took us all day. But this was really important because when we went into meetings with leadership, with other heads of units and departments, with our academic partners, we had a resource literally at our hands that we could hand folks that served as an entry point to the virtual learning community program. And it really served as that jumping off point to get us going on what was a year's worth of planning in just a couple of months. TJ also mentioned that we did take a committee-based planning approach. Again, collaboration is the core of our work. We don't make decisions in our learning communities without consulting our partners. It's just not in our practice. So we had these different committees that looked at different components around the learning communities, and invited campus partners from key units across campus to participate in these. So these were some of our academic partners, typically are ones who have been with us for a while and have a good, strong knowledge of the learning community program, but also folks from our student involvement office, our orientation office, the folks who are looking to onboard our next group of incoming students. We had marketing folks from across the campus joining us. These were weekly meetings with a lot of work outside, and we did all of it collaboratively. We guide that work on our team, but it is done with a lot of input to make sure that when we finished the virtual learning community product, when we were unveiling it and executing it, that we had buy-in from every stakeholder because they felt that their voice and their work helped to shape and mold that model. And so even though this took us quite a bit more time than if Aysha, TJ, and I had just locked ourselves in a Zoom room for a while, it ultimately led to a much more collaborative product.
We also used a couple project management tools, so mainly Asana and OneDrive. So if folks know or don't know Asana, it is a project management software. So we have kind of the free version of it. It allows you to do things like assign tasks out, set deadlines, easily organize tasks into projects. So we really use that mostly internally for kind of broad topics and broad tasks that would get assigned out to one of us that then we would manage the process down the road with other folks in our committees. So that really helped us stay organized and be able to, all three of us are very much, check off a box type of people. So allow us to see that, ourselves making progress along the way. And then we also use OneDrive. And so that allowed us to easily be able to collaborate on documents and also easily share documents within our organization. Just being able to share the link was very easy. We also eventually transitioned to a group or a library within OneDrive for our VLCs. And so that was a great place for our partners to be able to come as a one-stop shop for things like planning notes, any kind of marketing or application materials that they needed to access, rosters, engagement resources, things like that. They just had a link to this library. It allowed you to restrict access. So it could live out there, but only certain people can access it. So we went through and we're pretty strict on our access. So only those folks could access it. But it really helped us, again, centralize everything to one location. So we weren't, something wasn't living in one of our personal OneDrive locations. So again, another reflection component here. So how long does it typically take to plan for key components of your program or initiative? So again, thinking back to that timeline that we talked over, if you had to, how can you compress the timeline? Where can you find ways to kind of shave off some time to make your program or initiative successful? What foundational research exists to support the goals and outcomes of your program or initiative? Again, Devon spoke to, we don't do anything without consulting our research. We always go ready to be able to share with people, here's why this matters and here's why we know that this works. And how strong are your key partnerships? We're going to mention a little later on when we get into some of our successes, but we were able to leverage some key partnerships. And like Devon mentioned, existing partnerships that we were going to bring on for the next academic year anyways, get them onboarded a little earlier. So how strong are those partnerships that you have and what can you do to maybe strengthen those going forward?
When folks started to get wind of a VLC model, some folks started to reach out to us to ask us how, and we cannot really talk about this program or this process without acknowledging the resources that we had easily available to us right at our fingertips. We want to acknowledge as well that these put us in a privileged place to be able to pivot our learning communities to a virtual learning community model, and that not everyone has these resources at their fingertips. Partnerships and the importance and the trust and the time that it has taken us to build these partnerships, the partnerships, none of this could have happened without them. And this is why you will constantly hear us say the partnerships were a critical resource. Our ability to get this many partners to pivot this quickly relied on us to use our clout and our trust that has been built over the last over a decade of learning community programs for us to be able to pivot these communities. We had to be able to tell our existing partners partners, hey, come along with us, trust us. We think we're making the right decision, keep that partnership. And then, as Devon mentioned, we had to go to partners that we're not planning to onboard until this coming year and say, hey, would you mind coming a year early to this table and launching a virtual learning community a year before you had planned? We really wanted every single student to find a virtual learning community, which meant that we had to have every college at the table. And we didn't have every college at the table in our pre-existing LLC model. So those existing partnerships, none of this could have happened without it, and it was critical. Outside of those learning community partnerships, we also have strong established partnerships with other colleagues within our own division of University Life, which is Student Affairs at Mason, that we could bring to the table and say, hey, we can't do this alone, we need your help. We also had strong partnerships with enrollment management. They often refer to us as the easiest folks to work with. And because we do what they ask us to do when they ask us, we could ask back and say, hey, we need your help in this space to make this happen. We also had very strong leadership support. This was guided by our Vice President for University Life, so our VPSA, as well as our Vice President of Enrollment Management. They really supported this initiative once they saw the potential for its positive impacts on our enrollment and retention numbers. So we didn't have to do a lot of convincing. They pretty much took our word for it and we were able to run. I recognize that not everyone has that. So even though we did have to create a proposal and provide evidence of why this was the best way to go, once we had done that, we pretty much had their support along the way throughout the summer and met with them on about a monthly basis to provide them with updates along the way. In addition, we had the financial resources. We quickly were able to take resources that we were going to use for our in-person model and leverage them to a virtual model, not only in the budget, but also in the staffing. So we were quickly able to say, okay, our student staff, instead of being RAs, are now going to be VLC mentors. We were able to work with our community directors and say, instead of helping to support an in-person model, you're going to help to support a virtual learning community model. The residential academic engagement team, so Devon and TJ, were pivoted to work with an entirely virtual model. So not only those financial resources, but also the people resources that are essential to make a learning community happen. We were very quickly able to pivot them from supporting our in-person model to supporting the virtual model. And then in addition to that, because the VP for Enrollment Management was a huge proponent of this program, he was able to secure for us a tuition discount for students who were participating in our VLC model. Not only did that help with recruitment to the VLC model, but it also was used as a retention tool to keep students from choosing to go to a different institution during this time. And then last but not least, we had existing technology platforms that allowed us to very quickly pivot from an in-person model to a virtual model. As was already mentioned, we have a partnership with Campus Groups and have a Mason 360 page as our engagement platform. This is where all our virtual learning communities live, where the students engage with each other and with their faculty and coordinators, as well as HRL staff. And we also have StarRes for our application platform. So we were very quickly able to create an application within that housing assignments technological platform for the VLC model. Quick check-in with our reflection. So how much does your unit or campus leadership know about your program or initiative? Like Devon said, we still had to make a case for this. We still had to write that proposal and really think about our why and talk to that. But the fact that they knew the learning community model existed and was a strong foundation meant that they kind of came to us, right? They saw this as a potential place to really leverage that virtual engagement to help with retention efforts. What does your funding model look like? I already mentioned, we know not everyone has that same funding resources, so we want to have you think about that. And then last but not least, what tools and resources are most important for your work, and do you already have them?
We are going to take a minute and talk through what we came up with after a few months of planning and what we have been executing since August in our virtual learning communities. This here is our list. This was the final graphic that went out right as we launched our marketing campaign. The honeycomb hexagon is kind of our logo in terms of our learning communities. These are 20 different learning communities that, again, go across academic interest or identity. Some of them were brand new in the virtual setting. This is really a point of pride, we only lost one learning community, and it was our outdoor adventure learning community, who, as folks might imagine, struggled to figure out how to convert that to a virtual setting. I don't blame them at all. That would be really challenging, but we were really proud of this. Every single one of these hexagons is at least one campus partner. Some of them are multiple campus partners if the academic component is separate. We met with all of these partners individually, sometimes more than once, sometimes in groups, and we have good relationships with a lot of these offices in order to make this happen. So as Aysha said, we worked pretty hard to ensure that any student who is interested in virtual learning communities would be able to look at that list and find something that they connect with, something that they identified with. We ended up with a little over 1,100 students in our virtual learning communities, which is very exciting, considering that they all had to reapply whether they were already placed in a living learning community or not. And we had about 60% of our students are off campus. So about 60% of our virtual learning community students are living not on our residential campus. It's important to note for this academic year only, we have no in-person learning communities. We completely sunsetted that in favor of this. So even if our students are living on campus and participating in a virtual learning community, they are not co-located physically in any way. It was pretty important for us that we did not promote in-person engagement, and it's really hard to say you're living with people who have same interests as you, don't go knock on their doors. So we kept it all virtual for this list. There are still really core components. So even though each community has its own flair, its own unique topic, there are still core components. We're still partnered. These are all still co-owned. We don't make decisions about these communities without talking to their partners. We verified with all of them that they were willing to come on board. We have a core staff team that works outside of our team for each individual community. So our community directors, who are still also working with our on-campus population, are also assigned to a series of learning communities online that they work with a VLC coordinator who is a staff member in our partnered unit, and as well as our VLC mentors, which as mentioned are what we converted our resident assistants to, which also means that not all of our VLC mentors are living on campus with us anymore. Some of them are living at home and participating and supporting this entirely virtual. All of our VLCs are still requiring a course at the first year level. Some of them have an optional or required course at the upper level as well. We have a residential curriculum at Mason, and we did also work at the same time, but separately, to convert that curriculum to a virtual setting. And all of our virtual learning communities go through that. Even though the students aren't living together, they're still growing and learning, and we have a skills-based curriculum, which is still applicable to wherever they are currently living. So that applies across the board. And then we also still, one of the hallmarks of our learning community experience are really cool initiatives and events that the students get to participate in. That's still happening in a virtual setting. Some of the examples that I like to give, our Honors College just had an engineer from NASA come to speak, which was really popular. We have folks who are having faculty cooking nights, study sessions, all sorts of really innovative ways to bring the students in and get them to connect, which is the same as what we do in person, just in a different setting.
So I have the fun part of talking about some of our successes in our planning. So first and foremost, we met our student population needs, right? As Devon mentioned, every college or school at Mason has a VLC. And that was really important for us, for students to be able to find kind of where they fit and where they belong within one of these communities. We expanded from 13 living learning communities to 20 virtual learning communities. And there's participation from both on-campus and off-campus students, which was, again, something really important for us. As Devon said, 60% of the students are off-campus. Secondly, we increased collaboration. So we had the buy-in from existing partners. We got buy-in from new partners as well. And we helped them get onboarded, again, a little bit earlier than we had planned for our new model coming fall 21. We got them onboarded a cycle earlier, which, again, looking back, is kind of a silver lining to be able to easily do it for fall 21. We already have them. They're kind of in our bubble and kind of know how learning communities work. And we also increased the campus knowledge about the learning community program. All of a sudden, we were in rooms and at tables that we weren't at before. So anything that we can do to kind of increase our campus partners' knowledge about the communities and about our programs, we consider that a pretty big success. We had a quick and successful launch. So we created and launched a brand new application in less than a month in StarRez and processed nearly 1,200 applications through that process. And we also had a comprehensive marketing campaign comprised of info sessions, social media posts across various social media platforms, and a brand new website as well, all up and running in under a month. And then finally, we actually increased our total student participation in our learning community. So in academic year 2019-2020, we had about 900 students in our living learning communities. And this past year, 2020-2021, we had 1,100 students, just over 1,100 students in our virtual learning communities. So in a year where all numbers were kind of trending down and decreasing, we managed to actually increase numbers there, which again was a pretty big success for us.
I get the less fun one to talk about our planning challenges. As I hope that we have emphasized, it was quite a time crunch to do what we did. We often had to make decisions without having all of our information to inform them. This team is very much about planning and looking at pros and cons and mapping best options, and we just did not have the time to do that. So we had to kind of trust our gut in a lot of places and move forward. We haven't learned how to clone ourselves yet, so we couldn't be in multiple meetings at once, and so there's only so many meetings you can do in one day. Meeting overload was very intense during, especially the months of June and July, and so that was pretty stressful and impacted our work. It's not something I would ever say I wanted to do again. It was a great learning opportunity, but again, I'd like to go back to I have a year to plan, but unfortunately life doesn't always allow that. Staff stress was also very real. We had folks who were joining our planning tables who this was the first time that they had touched learning communities, and we had folks who had been here for a while and everything in between. So we were constantly onboarding folks and helping their own development and knowledge while helping them inform what we were building. We were also putting in a lot of extra time on this team, a lot of extra hours. It sometimes felt like we were meeting impossible deadlines. We take months to build an application, and I think it was like, we need one by next week. Great. And so that was also very real. We are planners, and that affected us. And as we've mentioned, collaboration is incredibly important to us. There were a couple of times that we had to make decisions without checking in with every single one of our partners, and that doesn't feel good or fit our model. We had to lean back on that trust and say, listen, we know that we weren't able to have this discussion. We were able to defend this decision, but we need you to trust us and go along with us. And for the most part, that happened. We had folks who kind of took us at our word, and even though they weren't able to give us their opinion, it still didn't feel good. It still didn't meet kind of the core of our work, but it's what we had to do, and we only had a few months.
So we've wrapped up one semester. We're a month and some change into another semester. Here's some quick lessons learned before we take some questions at the end. Transitioning was not as easy as we thought. It's not just as easy as we don't have these anymore, we're just going to do these. Constantly we went, oh crap, we didn't think of that. And we had to develop a plan for that thing we hadn't thought about. So as the planning progressed, it got more and more complex, and we had to make more and more complex decisions with less and less information to make them. We also have quickly realized that the traditional engagement models do not always work in the virtual setting. So Devon mentioned our residential roadmap, which is our curricular approach here at Mason in Housing and Residence Life. That committee has had to constantly make additional plans and pivot our roadmap to increase engagement in the virtual setting for our virtual learning community mentors, as well as our faculty and the students in those experiences. Zoom fatigue is real, and that is something that we are seeing in the engagement in particular. Hanging out with your friends in the lounge is very hard to replicate in a virtual model, and that's one of the core components of a learning community model, that social engagement kind of outside the classroom. And we are recognizing more and more that our students are fatigued by virtual learning and then also virtual engagement. But our student staff are incredibly resilient, and many of them will continue to try. They are very invested in connecting with students and providing them with that support in this virtual setting. So they will continue to try multiple methods, modes, approaches, platforms, ways to connect with their students, and they continue to put in that effort, and we're really proud of that work. As Devon mentioned, we also realize that not every learning community translated to the virtual setting. This is true even for some of the ones that we do have in the virtual setting. They have had to, again, reassess what used to work no longer works. How do we pivot some of our plans that we had for this year to engage students in that virtual setting? And then something that we don't want to go without saying is we used a lot of our resources to make this happen, including our people resources, the clout and trust we've developed with our partners. And so we are going to need to be pretty careful in the kinds of asks that we make of the partners that we made a lot of asks of last summer moving forward, and work to build that back up, right? Because they did join us on this journey, and it hasn't been perfect. But that being said, we're incredibly grateful for their ability to join us in the journey. And so we need some settling, if you will, some normal operations to build some of that trust back up. And with 4 minutes remaining, that is the end of our formal presentation. We do want to point out that we have our contact information here. So all 3 of our personal emails, as well as our main LLC email, any 4 of these will get you in the right direction. And then we do want to encourage you to look at our website, as our new model for next academic year has already launched and is reflected in our new website. So I guess if you do have a question, you're welcome to either raise your hand or I think you can unmute yourself and certainly ask it in this space.
I have a quick question. I know you just mentioned your new model on your website. Do you all plan to keep these virtual learning communities in a whatever post-pandemic actually means world?
So currently our plan, and plans change, but our current plan is that we are returning to a full in-person model for the next academic year. So if we think about the resources and the capital it takes to put on a learning community model, our team's focus is going to have to go back to our residential students, right? We are going to have to put our team and our staff and all of our funding and everything back into our residential students. And we are actually launching a model that's planned to get us close to about 3,000 students to participate, which is pretty heavy. So we are not planning currently on maintaining the virtual learning community model into next year. That being said, there was a lot of good knowledge and resources that went into this, and we recognize that there is benefit beyond a pandemic setting to continue. So we're working on beginning the discussions on a much more reasonable planning timeline than a couple of months on what would it look like for this program to exist in a long term, and how would it work with a very strong residential program that already exists. So we are hoping in the future, not academic year, to see it. We are also realistic and know that even if we have in-person learning communities this coming fall, we will continue to need some level of virtual engagement in order to meet our goals and outcomes, just given the trajectory of how things are going. So some of the virtual lessons we have learned will still continue to apply as we look at that new learning community model.
And a question in the chat around assessment. I'm going to go ahead and answer it, and then if folks want to, Devon or TJ want to chime in, please do. So how are you assessing resident and partner satisfaction and learning? A couple different ways. So first, we did pre and post assessment in the fall semester of all of our virtual learning community students. We actually did it of all of our first year residential and virtual learning community students. So we did an assessment at the start of the semester and did an assessment at the end of the semester. Our assistant director of assessment is currently conducting the analysis on that data for us. In addition, we host about twice a semester in the fall, and we just hosted our first one last week, focus groups with our VLC mentors, which again are those virtual RAs. We ask them a series of questions around kind of their perceptions, their experience, how are things going, and they have provided us some really solid feedback on that experience. In addition, we meet every single month, the first Tuesday of every month, with our learning community coordinators. So these are folks in the non-housing units who help to coordinate these communities. And those are prime opportunities, and they don't miss an opportunity to provide us with feedback. So we often ask, how are things going? And they do share that as well. And then I will point out that because all of our VLC students are going through the residential roadmap, we have identified certain roadmap initiatives that do have assessment metrics connected to them. And that data is something that our assessment team looks through. Two of them are our intentional conversations that we call our knock and talks, have an assessment metrics that our assessment team reviews and analyzes that data, as well as a few others, including our crucial conversation, which happens once in the fall and once in the spring. So some of our roadmap initiatives have assessment built into them. And then I will also say, as Devon mentioned, all of our first year virtual learning communities had a linked course. So there's assessment metrics that are involved in that curriculum and those courses that we hope to get from our faculty who teach those sections. And it is 2:01. So that was a long answer. We are so grateful to have shared a little bit of our program with you all. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you do have any questions.